Welcome to the Crime Records channel, and today we dive into the heartbreaking story of Geeta, a young woman trapped in an abusive marriage. Her fight for survival, escape from violence, and the shocking twist that changes her life forever will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe for more real-life crime documentaries. In a poor village in India, Geeta's name floated gently like a breeze through every muddy street. She was born into a family with nothing to spare. Her parents worked hard, barely managing to make ends meet. From an early age, Geeta understood what hardship meant. Her family's dilapidated roof leaked when it rained. The surrounding fields were ravaged by drought, and even basic food became a luxury. Despite the poverty, Geeta's beauty was admired by everyone in the village. Her eyes, as clear as lake water, her slender figure and sweet smile were like a ray of light in an otherwise dull environment. Her parents had long realized that Geeta's beauty might be the only chance to change their fate. In this land, beautiful girls were often seen as an asset, even capable of bringing about a family's change of fortune. Geeta had a secret memory in her heart, a love story that was the purest of her life. Her first love was with a young man from the same village, Alwyn. That relationship, like a gentle morning breeze, was tender and innocent, but also filled with reluctance and regret. Alwyn was a young man in the village, and his family was no wealthier than Geeta's. However, he always had a certain strength about him that made people feel at ease. Unlike Geeta's father, who toiled day and night, Alwyn had a quiet confidence, a sort of serenity that suggested he always found a way to survive the harshest environments. He wasn't a man of many words, but there was something reassuring about his presence. Geeta and Alwyn's acquaintance was simple. They had known each other since childhood, living in the same impoverished village, but their paths had never truly crossed. Until one summer, when Geeta was working in the fields and suddenly felt dizzy and faint. As she was about to rest, Alwyn happened to pass by and noticed that she wasn't feeling well. He stopped, handed her a bottle of water, and asked if she was okay. In that moment, Geeta felt a warmth she hadn't known in a long time. Alwyn's simple act of kindness wasn't grand, but it was enough to let her know he cared. From that day onward, Geeta and Alwyn found themselves spending more time together. Every morning, Geeta worked in the fields, and Alwyn often passed by. They would stop and chat briefly about simple things. Alwyn would tell her about the world beyond the village, sharing the new sights he had encountered when he traveled to the city. Geeta, on the other hand, would talk about her dreams for the future and her hopes for a better life. Even though they both lived in poverty, their companionship and shared aspirations brought them a sense of comfort during those long days. One day, as Geeta and Alwyn walked down a small path in the village, the sun was setting in the distance, painting the sky orange and red. Alwyn gently took Geeta's hand, and in that moment, her heart skipped a beat. She didn't need him to say much. The silence between them was enough to communicate their feelings. Alwyn softly said, "If one day I can give you a better life, would you walk with me?" Geeta's eyes sparkled, and a surge of emotion flooded her heart. They didn't have lofty expectations. Alwyn never promised her a life of luxury, and he knew he might never be able to provide for Geeta in material terms. But he believed that if they had each other, they could endure the hardships together. He was certain that someday their efforts would lead to a better life. Geeta's heart was full of conflict. She knew Alwyn's love was sincere, and she had already developed deep feelings for him. She longed to walk into the future with him, sharing every joy and sorrow. But the harsh reality of life weighed heavily on her. She knew that while Alwyn had dreams and passion, in this world, dreams alone weren't enough. Their families remained poor, and their life was still a struggle. Geeta had heard many elders talk about the meaning of marriage, that it wasn't just a union of love, but also a means of securing one's livelihood. Her parents had already arranged her marriage, and that decision had almost become her fate. She had little room to question it. Alwyn, though offering warmth and hope, could not change her difficult reality. One evening, as Geeta and Alwyn sat together on the edge of a field, the world around them was silent. The sun was setting, and Alwyn suddenly looked at Gita, his eyes full of expectation. "Gita, I know life is tough, but I will work hard, I really will. If we don't give up, one day we will have a better life," he said. Gita's heart trembled, and she knew she couldn't reject this sincere man. But deep down, there was a greater sadness. She lowered her head and spoke in a soft voice. "Alwyn, I love you, but I'm afraid our future will never change." These words seemed to reveal the deepest fears in Gita's heart. She knew that although she loved Alwyn, the challenges they faced were greater than just the bond between them. She had to face not only poverty, but also the pressure of societal and family-imposed marriage and the deep uncertainty about the future. Alwyn looked at Gita's silent face, a sense of helplessness and pain filling his heart. He knew that their love had already encountered insurmountable obstacles. Despite their genuine affection and shared dreams, the reality they lived in made the future seem increasingly uncertain. Gita began to realize that the choice before her was not an easy one. She yearned for love, for a life with Alwyn, but the harshness of life made it impossible for her to ignore the potential challenges ahead. Deep in her heart, she could already feel the weight of destiny's cruel hand, and she wasn't sure whether she could resist it. Gita's family had always been overshadowed by poverty. Although she was the only daughter, she had never received special pampering. Her parents loved her, but more than that, they worried about her future. Everything in the house was simple, and almost every morning Gita would be in the shabby kitchen preparing breakfast for the whole family, then help her parents and brothers work in the fields. The hardship of life had taught her to shoulder responsibilities and endure from an early age. Her parents often spoke in hushed tones by the fire at night, discussing Gita's future. These conversations had become more frequent after she grew up. Her mother, Mata, once said to her, "Gita, a woman is the treasure of her family. If she marries well, the family will be secure." Mata's words were not tender. There was more resignation to reality in them. She knew that she and her husband had struggled their whole lives on this barren land, unable to change their family's fate. And Gita, as the only hope, had become the key to their family's future. Gita had heard this many times. Whenever she nervously brought up her thoughts about marriage, her mother would comfort her with these words, as if everything had already been decided. Gita couldn't help but feel a sense of suffocation. She knew she was not just carrying her own emotional pain, but also the pressure from her family and society. Everything changed on a typical winter morning. Gita was at home, tidying up the house, when her father came to find her, looking serious. Gita felt a surge of unease and had an inkling of what was coming. Her father's expression always carried a sense of a suppressed anxiety. "Gita, listen to me." His voice was low, breaking the silence. "You know our situation, and you know your mother and I have worked our whole lives. Now there's an opportunity, and it's the only chance for our family to change its fate. You need to listen carefully." Gita looked up at her father. His face, etched with the marks of time and burden, seemed heavier today. "There is a wealthy merchant willing to marry you. You know this isn't just about you. You are the hope of our family. Marrying him is the only way for our family to change its future." These words were like a heavy blow to Gita. She had always thought that she could walk her own path, maybe even with Alwyn by her side, and have a different future. But now, her father was asking her to marry a completely unknown man. A man whom Gita knew was wealthy, but whom she felt no connection to at all. A wealthy merchant. This was a choice she had never considered. And Gita understood that her parents saw this opportunity not as a chance for her happiness, but as a chance for the family's future, even for the whole village. To them, Gita was merely a key to the family's destiny. Once she married, everything might change. "His name is Arvi, from a rich family of merchants in the village," her father continued. "Although he has some intellectual difficulties and cannot take care of himself, he is the only one who can bring change to our family. You must understand, this is the greatest contribution you can make to our family." Gita's heart felt like it was being torn apart. The man her parents had chosen for her was someone she knew could never offer her the love, security, or comfort that Alwyn could. Arvi had never crossed her mind as a suitable partner. He was mentally delayed, unable to care for himself, and Geeta saw him as nothing more than a burden. He would never be able to provide the warmth and support she longed for. Tears welled up in Geeta's eyes. She struggled to keep calm. "But Arvi doesn't love me, and I don't love him. We're just making a deal, aren't we?" Her voice trembled, but each word seemed to echo her deepest pain. Her father sighed deeply and lowered his head. "Geeta, this is not just about you and him. You are our only hope. We cannot bear more poverty. This world is not as simple as you think. Arvi's family can provide everything, money, resources, even a life you could never have dreamed of." Geeta's struggle deepened. She thought of the mornings and evenings she had spent with Alwyn. Those moments had been the only warmth in her life. Yet now those beautiful dreams seemed so fragile in the face of reality, like sand slipping through her fingers. She knew Alwyn could not change her fate, and her own family could no longer afford to indulge her longing for love. In that moment, Geeta realized that her fate was no longer in her hands. Her parents, society's expectations, and even her whole family's future seemed to dictate her life. Perhaps she could give up everything to pursue personal happiness, but doing so would mean abandoning her family's burden. "You don't have to say more, I understand," Geeta said softly, her tears finally falling. She no longer looked at her father. She knew that this decision was beyond her control, and she would have to accept the cold, harsh reality. The days that followed were a blur. Geeta barely spoke to her parents, retreating into the small house, her heart as cold as stone. She had once dreamed of a beautiful future with Alwyn, but those dreams now felt empty. She knew she had no choice. Fate had already decided her path, and she could only follow it. Finally, the wedding day arrived. Geeta put on a wedding dress she had never imagined she would wear and stood coldly on the stage. Her parents were busy on the sidelines, wearing expressions of satisfaction and hope. Her wedding was not for love, but for changing the family's fate. And she, as a woman, seemed destined to lose everything in this heartless transaction. Arvi stood next to her, expressionless, looking at her. Though he did not understand Geeta's pain or struggle, there was perhaps a silent expectation in his slow gaze. Geeta knew that this marriage was not something she could control. Yet she clenched her teeth, trying not to break down in the middle of the ceremony. This marriage might bring her material comfort, but her heart would never find peace. The moment Geeta stepped into Alvi's home, she did not feel the joy and anticipation she had imagined. Instead, there was an indescribable heaviness in her heart. She glanced around. The luxurious home stood in stark contrast to the impoverished rural life she had left behind. Intricately carved furniture, paintings hanging on the walls, shiny floors. Every detail spoke of wealth and opulence. Yet, despite the material wealth far surpassing her expectations, Geeta felt an oppressive air in the house that she could not shake. Alvi showed no sign of affection. His gaze was distant and indifferent, as if he were mechanically fulfilling a duty rather than expressing any real emotion. Geeta felt a wave of disappointment wash over her, though she did not express it. After all, this was her marriage, and she had no power to resist anything. She could only endure silently, feeling like an outsider in this new life that was supposed to be her future. Alvi's house and the life she had once imagined grew more distant each day. She had once envisioned finding her place in this grand home, but reality was far crueler. Alvi rarely spoke to her. He was often silent, locked away in his room, and when he did emerge, it was only to speak a few hurried words before retreating back into his own world. Geeta had no great expectations from him, but at least she had hoped for some warmth, some kindness, even if it was occasional. However, what made her most uneasy was Alvi's father, Ravi. Ravi was a tall, imposing man with a powerful presence and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through anything in their path. He exuded an air of authority that made Geeta uncomfortable. While he often wore a cold smile, his eyes were filled with a sense of menace and cruelty that she couldn't quite explain. When Gita first met Ravi, he was discussing matters with some servants in the yard. When he saw Gita approach, he gave her a dismissive once-over. In that instant, Gita felt as though she were being suffocated by his unspoken gaze. She quickly lowered her head, avoiding his eyes, and hurried into the house. As the days passed, Gita began to notice that Ravi was not as simple as he appeared. He did not show her the affection a father might show his daughter-in-law. Instead, he often looked at her with a cold, calculating stare. Occasionally, he would mutter things that left Gita feeling unsettled. Every time he came near, she felt a chill run down her spine. It was as though every step he took toward her was a silent threat, and she could not escape it. At first, Gita thought she might be overly sensitive, that perhaps she was just struggling to adjust to the new environment. But things began to escalate, and she could no longer ignore the growing discomfort. One late evening, as Gita went to the kitchen for a glass of water, she unexpectedly encountered Ravi. He was standing there, and when he saw her, his gaze was no longer simply cold. It was filled with desire and a sense of aggression. He stepped closer to her, and Gita's body stiffened in fear. "You're still up? Aren't you tired?" Ravi's voice was low and gravelly, carrying an unsettling weight. Gita froze, unsure of how to respond, her mind racing as she tried to avoid looking at him. She could barely breathe, feeling an increasing sense of dread. But Ravi didn't leave. Instead, he took a few steps closer. Gita felt her heartbeat quicken, her limbs trembling with panic. He was moving toward her as if he were some kind of predator, and she was its helpless prey. Then, without warning, he reached out and touched her shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, Gita's body tensed violently, her face turning ashen. She could barely keep her legs steady, as though they might give way at any moment. She wanted to resist, but fear had taken hold of her. Ravi's hand slid slowly down her neck, his voice a whisper barely audible. "Aren't you afraid of me, Gita? You're very beautiful, you know." Gita's heart pounded as if she couldn't breathe, her mind screaming for escape. Her body was paralyzed with terror, and she could not even find the strength to speak. Please let go of me. Go away," she managed to stammer, her voice trembling with fear. Ravi chuckled darkly, a glint of cruelty flashing in his eyes, but he didn't leave. Instead, he seemed to enjoy the power he had over her, as though she were a toy to be played with. He looked her up and down, his gaze hungry and insistent. From that night on, Ravi's harassment became more frequent. He would find ways to invade Gita's privacy, slipping into her room when she was alone, his presence overbearing, his touch suffocating. Every time Gita fought to retain control over herself, but each incident left her more broken. Her body grew weaker, each encounter leaving an indelible mark on her soul. Yet she could do nothing but endure. She had no one to turn to. Alvi remained indifferent, as he always had. He showed no concern for her suffering. Gita knew there was no one to help her, no one who would believe her. Her parents, having already married her off to this family, had no power to save her now. As the days passed, Gita's spirit began to break. Her body grew frail, and her once vibrant soul dimmed with every act of cruelty Ravi subjected her to. She could not escape. This house, this man, had become her prison, and she was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The hope she once held for a better life faded with every violent encounter, every painful memory. Her body and soul were being destroyed, piece by piece, and yet she had no choice but to endure. In the face of this unrelenting torment, Gita felt her strength evaporating, her dreams slipping further and further away. She had no way of escaping this hellish life, and as each day passed, she sank deeper into despair. Gita's days grew darker and darker, filled with indescribable pain and humiliation. Ravi's violent actions were no longer confined to secret assaults in the dead of night. They became increasingly public, unabashedly played out in front of everyone in the house. He would provoke her with his gaze, humiliate her with his words, and even openly shout and hit her in front of others, trapping her in an endless cycle of shame and suffering. It was as if she had become a silent object in the household, and no one truly cared about her feelings. Every time Ravi approached her with that disgusting smile, Gita could hardly bear it. His gaze was like a sharp blade, ruthlessly slicing away at her dignity and will. The repeated humiliation and violence wore down Gita's spirit, and she became numb. She had learned to lower her head, close her eyes, and try not to look at Ravi's cold face, because every glance at him felt like a tear in her very soul. She wanted to escape, but she knew she could not flee from the pain and helplessness that surrounded her. One day, Ravi once again insulted Gita in front of everyone. His voice thundered through the room, and he stood before her, pushing her into a corner with his brutal words. His eyes were filled with disdain and cruelty. Gita was on the verge of breaking down. Her body trembled, and her heart was full of unspeakable shame and anger. However, she had no choice but to endure, knowing that no matter how she struggled, nothing would change. Every person in the house chose to remain silent, as though her suffering and humiliation were of no consequence. Her mother, the woman who had once taught her how to be strong, now turned a blind eye. She never spoke out about Ravi's violent behavior, no matter how severe it got. Whenever Gita sought comfort from her, her mother would give her a cold, indifferent look. She would briefly shake her head, and then, without a word, continue with her day. "You're married into this family now. Endurance is your duty," her mother would coldly advise. Those words pierced Gita's heart like a sharp knife, making her realize that she had been completely abandoned by her family. Her father, too, showed no reaction. The violence that occurred in the house seemed to have nothing to do with him. He remained the high and mighty man, always indifferent to Gita's pain. Whenever Gita quietly approached him for help, he would gaze at her with cold eyes, fall silent for a moment, and then walk away, as if her suffering were none of his concern. Gita's heart was filled with profound despair and helplessness. She knew that her family no longer cared about her life or death, and even the most basic concern or compassion seemed to be absent. She had become nothing more than an insignificant pawn in their eyes. Every day she endured this violent shadow, existing in a world that had grown foreign and distant. Yet, despite everything, Gita still clung to a faint hope deep within her. She longed to escape this hellish home and yearned to live a life of her own, to experience freedom again. Every night as Gita lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the image of the boy who had once given her warmth and hope, Alwyn, would appear in her mind. She remembered his gentle gaze, the smile he had given her, and the promises he made. She longed for the day when she could return to the fields that had once belonged to her, back to a place full of dreams. But she knew that this was just an unreachable dream. She was already trapped in this house, unable to escape. Each time, Gita struggled inwardly, searching for an exit, but reality mercilessly pressed down on her, making it hard for her to breathe. Ravi's violence and insults showed no signs of stopping. In fact, they only worsened. Gita's body and mind were already severely damaged. Her eyes no longer sparkled, and the smile that had once graced her lips was long gone. She had become quiet and withdrawn, like a living corpse, losing all hope and motivation. She knew her future had been entirely stripped from her. The only thing she could do now was endure the endless humiliation and violence. Sometimes, late at night, Gita would quietly walk to the window and gaze out at the dark sky, her heart filled with a longing for a better future. She dreamed of escaping the darkness, of breaking free from the home that was filled with violence and humiliation. She fantasized about the day when she could once again experience freedom and live a life where no one could control her. But she knew how cruel reality was, and those dreams felt so distant. She hardly had the courage to believe that they could ever come true. Gita's heart was filled with a deep struggle. She hoped she could hold on, but every day of violence and humiliation chipped away at her hope. Her soul was sinking, her body was collapsing, but she never gave up that last glimmer of hope. She believed that even in the darkest moments, one day the light would shine into her life. Alwyn had been her first love, the young man who had once ignited a warm spark in her heart. They had shared beautiful moments together. Though their love had not made them wealthy, their hearts had been close, and they had relied on each other for support. However, fate had torn them apart, sending Gita into this unbearable household. Now, looking back, those innocent and happy days seemed to be the only light in her life, the only warmth she had known. She knew Alwyn still lived in the nearby village, though their contact had become sporadic over the years. Still, she vividly remembered his warm smile and the steadfastness in his eyes. Perhaps he no longer cared for her as he once did, but she decided to give herself one last chance. One quiet evening, Gita quietly took out paper and pen sitting by her bed and wrote the letter. Her hands trembled as tears flowed down her face, soaking the paper. The letter's content was simple and direct. She wrote, "Oh, dear Alwyn, perhaps you have already forgotten me, but I have never forgotten you. I don't know how you are doing, but I hope you can help me. My life has become unbearable, full of pain and oppression. Please come and rescue me. Take me away from this hell. I know you may have your own life now, but I really can't endure it any longer. Please help me. Gita." Each word felt like a cry from deep within her heart, carrying all her dependency and hope. She folded the letter carefully and hid it in her clothing, intending to sneak out the next day and send it when her family wasn't looking. The following day, Gita took advantage of the early morning light and secretly left the house. She found an old woman in the village who often delivered messages for outsiders and gave her the letter, pleading with her to deliver it to Alwyn. The old woman looked at Gita, filled with sympathy, yet she understood the significance of the letter and promised to take it to Alwyn's home. Several days later, Gita finally received Alwyn's reply. Her heart raced, and her hands shook as she opened the envelope, afraid she might miss a single word. The letter read, "Gita, I have never forgotten you. I know you have been suffering, and I know what you've been enduring. I have decided to do whatever it takes to help you. You no longer need to bear this violence and humiliation. I will find a way to take you away. I know it won't be easy, but together we will escape this hell. You must keep this a secret. Once I have everything arranged, I will come for you. Alwyn." Tears welled up in Gita's eyes again, and she felt a warmth deep inside her, as though her strength had been reignited. Alwyn had not forgotten her. He was still willing to do anything for her. This letter not only gave her a glimmer of hope, but also made her feel the love and care that she had longed for. But Gita also knew that escaping this family would not be easy. Ravi's violence had become more public, and her family remained indifferent to her suffering. She had to be very careful. No one could know about her plans. So Gita and Alwyn quietly began to plan their escape. Alwyn told her he would come for her one night, when the moon was dark, and take her away. They would sneak along a hidden path and leave the village, heading for a safe place. Gita's heart raced with each passing day. She finally saw a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel, yet she knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger. The escape would be filled with obstacles, and there could be unforeseen dangers. But even so, Gita no longer felt afraid. She knew she was no longer alone. She had love, she had courage, and she had hope. As Gita thought of the new life ahead of her, the one she could build with Alwyn, she still lived in a home filled with violence and indifference. Every day she carefully and cautiously planned their escape, but the light in her heart never faded. She was convinced Alwyn would come. He would take her away, and together they would pursue the future they deserved. With every passing day, Gita's resolve grew stronger, and the light in her eyes began to shine again. She was no longer the woman who could be easily controlled and had no voice. She would take control of her own destiny and seek freedom and happiness. It was a quiet night. The moonlight was obscured by clouds, with only faint light filtering through the window into Gita's room. The house was silent. Only the sound of her rapid breathing and the pounding of her heart could be heard. Gita quietly closed the door, trying not to make any noise. Her heart raced with both tension and excitement. Tonight was her last chance. She had to leave this home full of violence and humiliation. Alwyn was already waiting outside in the woods watching for her signal. Gita had prepared her belongings early, just a few clothes and some necessary daily items. She knew that once she stepped outside, her life would change forever. No matter the outcome, there would be no turning back. She glanced at the letter on the table, the last letter from Alwyn. In it he had outlined their escape plan, step by step. Gita took a deep breath and silently said to herself, "I can't take it anymore. No matter what happens, I have to leave." With a steady resolve, she quietly stepped out of her bedroom. The moment she stepped outside, she saw Alwyn's figure in the distance, already watching her. They exchanged a tense but determined look, quickly heading toward the deeper woods. At that moment, it felt like they were finally breaking free from all constraints, embarking on the long-awaited path to freedom. However, just as they were about to disappear into the night, a sound of footsteps broke the silence. Gita froze, her heart racing. She knew this could be the most dangerous moment. Suddenly, Ravi appeared before them, his vicious gaze locked onto Gita. Gita's heart sank. She could almost feel the malice emanating from him. "Do you really think you can escape?" Ravi sneered, slowly advancing toward them. Alwyn immediately stood in front of Gita, his voice filled with fury and resolve. "You won't lay a hand on her," he said, his tone resolute. Ravi saw Alwyn's reaction, and his eyes flashed with rage. Without hesitation, he lunged at Alwyn, his fists aimed at Alwyn's chest. Alwyn stood his ground and met him head-on. The two men grappled in the darkness, their fists and feet colliding with violent force, the air thick with the sound of their struggle. Gita stood by, watching helplessly. Her heart was filled with fear and helplessness, but she knew that Alwyn was the only one who could help her now. She understood that they had no choice but to break free from Ravi. Ravi's violence was evidently stronger than Alwyn's. His movements were quick and powerful. Alwyn was knocked to the ground, the pain causing him to gasp. Gita could no longer hesitate. She rushed forward, grabbing Ravi's arm in an attempt to pull him off, but he ignored her and continued attacking Alwyn with relentless force. At that moment, when Ravi raised his fist to strike Alwyn one final time, Alwyn suddenly grasped Ravi's wrist with all his strength. With a surge of energy, Alwyn pushed Ravi back, quickly standing up and delivering a heavy blow to Ravi's face. The punch was fueled by boundless anger and frustration. Ravi staggered back, his eyes filled with surprise. He took a few steps backward, then slowly collapsed to the ground as though all the strength had drained from his body. Alwyn stood frozen for a moment, staring at the fallen Ravi, his heart pounding. He still hadn't realized the severity of the situation. When Alwyn didn't stop but delivered another punch to Ravi's motionless body, he finally realized what had happened. Ravi was dead. He had hit him with such force that there was no turning back now. Gita stood in shock, her face pale, unable to believe what she had just witnessed. She knew that Ravi's death would change everything. Everything she had feared was now coming true. With the situation finally settling, Gita and Alwyn exchanged a glance, both of them feeling a mixture of fear and relief. They knew their lives had been irrevocably altered, and there was no going back now. "We need to leave right away," Alwyn whispered urgently, his eyes filled with panic. However, their escape was not going as planned. The next morning, Ravi's body was found, and the entire village was thrown into chaos. The police quickly launched an investigation, and soon they had locked on to Gita and Alwyn as the prime suspects. The brutal act of violence became the talk of the village, and villagers speculated about the reasons behind Ravi's death. Gita and Alwyn knew there was no turning back now. They fled the village immediately, beginning a dangerous journey of escape. Alwyn, who was familiar with the area, led Gita into the nearby mountains, trying to find a hiding spot. But their flight was far from easy. The police were already searching for them, and nearly every villager was cooperating with the investigation. Each day they worried about being discovered, their hearts weighed down by fear and hopelessness. Their escape had never felt more desperate. The dreams and hopes they had once held were now consumed by violence and terror. And now, with Ravi's death, they knew they would have to keep running, forever haunted by the consequences of that fatal encounter. The day Gita and Alwyn were arrested, their brief escape came to an end. Although they had tried to hide in the vast mountain forests, they were ultimately unable to escape the law. When the police arrived to take them back to the village, the entire village seemed to fall silent, with only the sound of the police sirens echoing through the empty streets. Gita and Alwyn had blank expressions on their faces, leaning on each other, their hearts full of indescribable fear. On the first day at the police station, Gita's tears hardly stopped. Her hands were cuffed to the chair and her gaze was vacant, as if her body and soul had been completely worn down by the torment of the past few months. She was asked to recount everything that had happened, answering each question the police asked. Gita's voice trembled and was weak. She no longer held anything back and began to recount the horror and humiliation she had endured in Ravi's house, one painful detail at a time. He started doing those things to me on the very first day after we got married, Gita choked out, her eyes flashing with unbearable pain. Every time, he would become like a madman, forcing me to endure his violence. My body became just a tool for him to release his anger. Her voice grew softer as she spoke, as if all the pain had rushed back to the surface. She had never shared these experiences with anyone before because she knew no one would believe a helpless woman. Even her family had turned a blind eye to Ravi's violence. She painfully recalled her mother, the woman who had once promised to protect her, watching her suffer without ever standing up for her. My parents, they knew what was happening. Gita looked up, her eyes empty. But they chose to ignore it. They said, "This is your fate. You're the responsibility of the family." They never saw the wounds I had. They never heard me cry. In that moment, Gita's voice was filled with both anger and helplessness. She tried her best to speak the truths hidden deep inside her, but felt as though she could no longer endure any more pain. She had never realized that her entire life would be controlled by such a ruthless society and family. The interrogation lasted for hours, with the police constantly asking about Alwyn's role, trying to understand his responsibility in this tragic event. Despite his endless guilt and regret, Alwyn maintained his position that he had acted out of a desire to protect Gita, which led him to lose control and kill Ravi. "I couldn't let him hurt her anymore." Alwyn's voice was hoarse, full of remorse. "She had suffered enough. I couldn't just watch her be destroyed. I just lost my mind." As the police took notes and analyzed the background of this violent tragedy, it became clear that for Alwyn, Ravi's death was not a simple murder, but a result of his frantic reaction to seeing Gita's pain and helplessness. He had acted out of a desire to protect Gita. However, things were not made simpler by Alwyn's emotional explanation. The court ultimately held a trial for the case. In court, Gita stood at the witness stand, her eyes no longer filled with confusion and helplessness, but instead with silence and strength. She told the judge and the jury everything she had endured, recalling the pain and helplessness she had suffered. She spoke of Ravi's sexual assault and violent behavior, as well as the silence and indifference of her family and relatives. The atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy and tense as everyone listened to Gita's narrative. Her voice trembled, but each word pierced deeply into the hearts of everyone present. Her tears had long since run dry, yet she continued to speak about the unspeakable events, as if all the suffering had become an inevitable part of her reality. After the trial, the court handed down its verdict. Alwyn was sentenced to 12 years in prison for the crime of manslaughter. Although he had acted out of a desire to protect Gita, the law could not overlook the fact that he had taken a life. Alwyn lowered his head, filled with guilt and regret for Gita. He knew that he could not change anything, and the price he had to pay for his actions was unavoidable. As for Gita as the victim, she was not completely exempt from the law either. The court ruled that although she had been a victim of violence, she had participated in the killing during her escape, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, the court also took into account the mental and physical trauma she had endured, particularly her helpless position in the marriage. They ruled that the suffering she had experienced outweighed her responsibility in the crime. After the judgment was announced, Gita showed no strong reaction. She simply lowered her head, silent, as if she had long since grown accustomed to the cruelty of fate. She knew that this trial was just one part of her painful journey, and all she had endured had far exceeded what the law could compensate. After the judgment, Gita and Alwyn were taken away, each starting their own prison sentences. Though their fate had been decided by the court, they both knew that this tragedy was far from over. For Gita, it was not just a legal trial, but an ongoing lifetime of suffering. And for Alwyn, his heart was still torn with remorse and pain. It seemed that everything was part of a trap laid by fate, a trap from which, no matter how hard they struggled, they could not escape its heavy shadow. After the case was closed, society quickly moved on. Gita and Alwyn's story was just one of many among countless victims of domestic violence. In reality, women like Gita, trapped in violent spirals, continued to be ignored by their families, society, and even the law. The victims of domestic violence are often voiceless, and the family members and relatives who choose silence are like accomplices to the abusers. Gita's story made people realize that violence is not confined to impoverished or special family backgrounds. It permeates all corners of society, deeply affecting the destinies of countless women. The ending of the story is not a happy one. It is painful and thought-provoking. We often neglect the voices of the victims, overlooking the endless suffering they endure. Gita's tears and Alwyn's remorse may not change society's indifference and cruelty, but they can spark attention to the plight of women in similar situations. They should not be forgotten, but instead deserve greater social attention and legal protection. The root cause of domestic violence lies not only in the perpetrator's crimes, but also in the society's lack of effective protection and intervention. For victims like Gita, only real care, understanding, and help can allow them to rise again, step out of the shadows, and embrace the light and freedom that belong to them.